began, as such things often do, with a scream. Not the strained cry of a startled audience member, nor the cultivated shriek of the stage. This was raw, immediate, and shockingly real. It cut through the velvet-draped hush of the Théâtre Opéra Étoile, like a dagger through silk, silencing the final notes of the orchestra with its ghastly finality. The ballerina had fallen. From the ornate catwalk above the grand proscenium, her body plummeted like a pale comet, limbs splayed in the unforgiving geometry of fear and gravity. She struck the stage floor with a brutal thud that silenced the world. Seconds later, the gasps came, then the shrieks, and then chaos. The morning papers would call it a tragic accident at Étoile. But in truth, it was anything but simple. The ballerina, Miss Célestine Marais, the crown jewel of the Parisian ballet, was not meant to be anywhere near the catwalk during that performance of La Sylphide. She had already danced her scene, bowed gracefully, and exited stage left to applause that bordered on reverence. No one had expected her to appear again, not above, not below, and certainly not plummeting to her death in front of a horrified crowd. There were murmurs, of course, whispers among the corps de ballet and backstage crew. Had she jumped? Was it despair? Love? Jealousy? A bitter rivalry? Or, God forbid, murder? The management at the Opera Étoile acted swiftly, as is customary in such elegant disasters. The remainder of the evening was cancelled. Patrons were ushered out with apologies and fine coats, and the police were summoned. The inspector assigned to the case, a stout, beady-eyed man named Lefebvre, was quick to declare an investigation. But despite his solemn pronouncements, the theatre remained cloaked in a thick fog of unanswered questions. And it was in this fog, just 2 days later, that a small, perfectly waxed moustache arrived in Paris. "Mon ami," said Hercule Poirot, leaning back in the upholstered seat of his private train compartment as he addressed the man across from him, "you do not need to look at me as though I am the angel of death." Captain Arthur Hastings, retired army man, occasional writer, and full-time chronicler of Poirot's adventures, frowned as he refolded the newspaper on his lap. "I wasn't, Poirot. Only, I do find it rather strange that you were invited here after the case was nearly closed." Poirot smiled thinly and tapped the side of his temple. When a ballerina falls once, it is tragic. When she falls twice, that, mon ami, is something else entirely. Hastings raised a brow. "She only fell once, didn't she?" "Ah," said Poirot with a mysterious glint. "We shall see." Poirot's arrival at the Théâtre Opéra Étoile was met with reluctant courtesy. The theatre director, Monsieur Bellamy, a tall, pale man with dark, worried eyes, seemed to receive Poirot more as a public relations necessity than a welcome ally. "It was an accident," he insisted, ushering them through the darkened theatre's side entrance. "The girl had been distraught for days. There were rumors, yes, but Paris thrives on gossip, Monsieur Poirot. It does not mean the fall was anything but a terrible misstep." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet you have invited me here." "Why?" Bellamy paused. His gaze shifted toward the stage, where a chalk outline marked the spot where Célestine had landed. "Because I fear that if it wasn't an accident, then it was someone I know, someone under this roof." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "Now we begin to see the shape of the truth." He glanced up toward the dizzying heights of the catwalks, where rigging and lighting crisscrossed in silent testament to the world behind the curtain. He folded his arms neatly. "Let us gather them, monsieur. The people who were here that night, the dancers, the managers, the crew, anyone with a secret, big or small." Bellamy hesitated. "You think they all have something to hide?" Poirot nodded. "Bien sûr, this is the theatre. Everyone wears a mask." The Théâtre Opéra. Étoile lay draped in shadows, even by day. Sunlight filtered weakly through stained glass panels high above the main lobby, casting colored shapes across marble floors, scuffed by hurried shoes and heavy trunks. Despite the absence of music, a faint sense of performance lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the drama and refused to release it. Poirot moved with his usual precise elegance, eyes surveying the space with quiet calculation. Hastings followed a step behind, taking mental notes of the theatrical decadence. Gilt-framed mirrors, dusty velvet curtains, and chandeliers dimmed now for the lack of an audience. Monsieur Bellamy led them down a narrow corridor flanked by posters of past triumph. Celestine Marais featured prominently in several, her poise unmistakable, her dark eyes steady, almost defiant. There were 13 people in the theater the night of the fall, Bellamy said without turning, not including myself. All of them knew Celestine, some better than others. All were questioned by the police, of course. Inspector Lefebvre concluded it was likely a suicide, but he faltered. "But you do not believe it," Poirot supplied, his voice calm. "I cannot afford to believe it. A suicide, perhaps. A scandalous affair that led to despair? Possibly. But it is also possible, horrifyingly so, that someone helped her fall." Poirot paused before a door labeled Salle de Répétition. He rested his hand lightly on the handle. "Then we must proceed as though it is so. The guilty often speak not through what they say, but what they avoid saying. We shall invite each person to speak, and I will listen with care. The contradictions, they always reveal themselves, n'est-ce pas?" They entered the rehearsal hall. Though functional in design, it held a muted elegance. The wide mirrors stretched along the wall, the scuffed wooden floors polished by thousands of practiced steps. A long table had been set up at Poirot's request. Chairs were arranged loosely around it. Bellamy turned to a young man with a clipboard near the door. "Henri, bring in the company, one by one, as Monsieur Poirot has instructed." Henri nodded and vanished. Poirot dusted the seat beside him and settled into it with graceful finality. "Let us begin, Hastings. The stage is set, the performance begins. Not with dance, but with the truth." The first to enter was a woman in her late 40s, severe in posture, with iron-colored hair scraped back into a bun that showed every tension of her thoughts. She introduced herself briskly as Madame Lisette Durand, the ballet mistress. "She was talented," Lisette said, her voice clipped. "Too talented, perhaps, and she knew it." "You suggest this is a flaw?" Poirot asked, peering at her closely. "Pride is always a flaw, Monsieur Poirot. In ballet, it is fatal. She was brilliant, yes, but she made enemies. One does not shine without casting shadows." "And who stood in that shadow?" Poirot asked. Madame Durand's eyes flickered, just briefly. Elodie, perhaps, or her own sister. But even I do not pretend to understand what passed between the dancers behind my back. Their world is close, claustrophobic. Confidences shift overnight. Poirot nodded slowly. "You mention her sister? She too was here that night." "Of course, Claudine Marais, her elder by 3 years. She was once the star, you know, until Celestine overtook her." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. And what was Claudine's opinion of this dethronement? Madame Durand's mouth tightened. She smiled through it. That is what dancers do. But the bitterness, it shows in the feet long before it reaches the lips. She rose without waiting to be dismissed. The next to arrive was Claudine Marais herself. She was striking in a very different way from her sister, taller, less delicate, more angular. Her smile was carefully composed, and yet Poirot noted the faintest trembling at the edges of her mouth. Grief? Or something else? "She was everything I wasn't," Claudine said softly, her eyes distant. They adored her for it. The critics, the audience. Even our parents treated her like she was something magical. I danced longer, but it never mattered. Hastings cleared his throat delicately. "Did you two get along?" Claudine looked at him for the first time. "We shared a dressing room, Captain Hastings. That should tell you all you need to know." "Did she seem troubled that evening?" Poirot asked gently. Claudine laughed bitterly. "Celestine was always troubled. If she wasn't pining for someone, she was fuming at them. She craved admiration, and when it came too easily, she despised those who gave it." "You suggest she had romantic entanglements?" Poirot said. "I suggest she had many," Claudine replied. "Men fawned over her. Women envied her. She was like a flame, beautiful and painful all at once." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, mademoiselle." Claudine rose and exited without another word. Henri stepped in and called for the next. Elodie Roche, one of the younger dancers, entered next. Her nervousness was evident, hands clenched in her lap, gaze darting around the room. She couldn't have been more than 20, with soft features and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Everyone wanted to be her," Elodie said when asked about Celestine. "I did too once, but it's not what you think. It wasn't just beauty or talent. It was the way people looked at her." Poirot leaned forward. "And did she return that admiration?" "Sometimes, but she could be cruel. She'd flatter you one day and cut you the next. I once heard her tell a designer his costumes looked like funeral drapes, during opening night." "And that night, was she acting strange?" Hastings asked. Elodie hesitated. "She was distracted. I saw her after the second act, just outside the dressing rooms. She looked like she'd been crying. I asked her if she was all right, and she said, 'I've danced for ghosts tonight.' I didn't know what she meant." Poirot's brow furrowed. "That is very curious indeed." Elodie wrung her hands. "I don't think she fell, not by accident." "Why not?" Hastings asked quickly. "Because I saw her climb the stairs to the rigging, and she wasn't alone." There was a long silence. "Who was with her?" Poirot asked. I don't know. I only saw a shape. Someone taller. A man, maybe. But they didn't come back down." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Why did you not tell this to the police?" Elodie looked down. "Because I'm afraid." Poirot gave a slow nod and rang the small silver bell beside him. Henri returned to escort Elodie out. As the door closed behind her, Hastings leaned closer. "That's a critical detail, Poirot." "Indeed, mon ami, a second figure, unseen by others. We now begin to sense the presence of the invisible actor." Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on the table. "We have learned many things. The sister, the rival, the mentor. All possess motive, but motive is only the beginning. Soon we must examine the method, and the mind that would employ it." A beat. "And I believe," Poirot added, rising with impeccable grace, "the next player on our stage shall give us just such an insight." Hastings blinked. Who's next? Poirot straightened his cuffs. The man Celestine could never quite forget, her former lover and the theater's principal sponsor. A shadow fell across the doorway as Henri returned, this time with a man impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his expression unreadable. "Ah," Poirot murmured, eyes gleaming. "Monsieur Julien Delacroix." And the real performance, Poirot thought, was about to begin. Julien Delacroix crossed the threshold with the deliberate confidence of a man used to commanding rooms, though a faint line between his brows betrayed the tension he fought to contain. He was lean and sharply dressed, his black hair slicked back with precise elegance, his gloved hands resting lightly at his sides. There was something about him, controlled, composed, that immediately set Poirot's senses alight. "Messieurs," Delacroix said with a courteous nod as he took the seat offered to him, "I assume you know why I'm here." "We are seeking clarity," Poirot replied, "and you, Monsieur Delacroix, knew Mademoiselle Marais perhaps more intimately than any who remain." The sponsor let out a slow breath. That depends on how you define intimacy. Let us begin then at the beginning, Poirot said, folding his hands. You were once involved with Mademoiselle Celestine. 2 years ago, we met during the spring gala. She was captivating, unpredictable. She made every man feel as though he were the first to ever fall at her feet. But it did not last. Poirot tilted his head slightly. And why did it not last, monsieur? Delacroix hesitated. Because I am not a fool. He offered no apology for the sharpness in his tone. Hastings shifted slightly in his seat, but Poirot only inclined his head. She played games, Delacroix continued, with everyone. You never knew if she loved you or merely wanted you to believe it. I tried to offer her something real, a future, security. But Celestine craved attention, not stability. She could not help herself. Were you in love with her? Hastings asked, more gently than Poirot would have. For the first time, Delacroix's composure faltered. I thought I was, until I saw what she did to others. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And yet you remained the principal sponsor of the ballet, even after the affair ended? I support the arts, Monsieur Poirot, not the people who ruin them. There was a short silence. And yet, Poirot said carefully, you were at the theatre the night she died. Delacroix met his gaze squarely. Yes, I attended most performances. I sat in my usual box, and I left shortly after the curtain fell. When the curtain was meant to fall, I should say. Before the other one did. You did not speak to her that evening? No. You are sure? Yes. Poirot paused for a long moment. Forgive me, monsieur, but Mademoiselle Élodie Roche claims that she saw Celestine climbing the stairs to the rigging, and that she was not alone. Delacroix's jaw stiffened, but he did not look away. And you think it was me? I think it is interesting that she spoke of dancing for ghosts, that she had been crying, that she died in a manner both dramatic and intimate. A fall from above, as though the heavens themselves rejected her. Delacroix gave a bitter smile. If you're asking whether I murdered her, the answer is no, but I cannot say I was sorry to see her gone. Poirot's voice was low, almost a whisper. That, monsieur, is a sentiment that can be heard louder than any confession. Delacroix rose smoothly, nodded, and walked out without waiting for dismissal. Poirot watched the door close behind him. He is angry, Hastings said. Oui, Poirot murmured, but not grieving. He stood and crossed the tall rehearsal room windows, which looked out upon the alleyway behind the theatre. Let us review. We have a woman who fell from the catwalk, a sister consumed with bitterness, a rival dancer with reason to fear and admire, a former lover with bruised pride and fraying restraint. And now, we must consider why she was on the catwalk at all. Hastings joined him by the window. If she was meeting someone there, it had to be arranged in secret. Poirot nodded. Precisely. But the theatre is full of secrets, no? Whispers behind curtains. Rendezvous in costume rooms. The question is not merely who met her, but what she expected to find. A knock at the door interrupted them. Henri peeked in. Madame Lagrange has arrived, Monsieur Poirot. Ah, Poirot said, brightening slightly. Let us not forget the grande dame. Madame Giselle Lagrange had once been a celebrated diva of the Paris stage. Though well past the age of performance, she remained a formidable presence. Her dress immaculate, her hat tilted at just the right angle to suggest both reverence and disdain. She swept into the room with the theatrical flair of someone who had never truly left the spotlight. Monsieur, she said with a deep, resonant voice, you wish to speak of Celestine. Poirot offered her a seat. Yes, madame, you were a mentor to her. I was her guardian, Lagrange corrected. After her parents passed, I saw potential in her. I trained her. I introduced her to the right people. She had the body of a swan and the mind of a storm. You speak of her with great affection, Poirot observed. Lagrange tilted her head. And frustration. Celestine never listened. She thought charm could replace discipline. She was not entirely wrong. "Did she confide in you?" Hastings asked. "Sometimes. Usually when it served her. She was frightened in her last weeks, though. She wouldn't say why." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Frightened of what?" Lagrange hesitated. "Of being followed. Of being watched. She believed someone had threatened her, but refused to say who. I thought it was jealousy at first. Rivalry among dancers. But she grew wary. She started carrying a letter in her bodice. She said it was for protection. Do you know what it contained?" I asked. She only smiled and said, "Insurance." Poirot leaned back, his mind clearly racing. "She told me something else, 3 nights before she died," Lagrange added, more quietly now. "She said, 'They think I'm still theirs, but I'm no one's possession.' I thought she was being melodramatic. Now I'm not so sure." Poirot gave a thoughtful nod. "Merci, madame. That will be all for now." When she left, Poirot turned immediately to Hastings, his voice low and precise. "Someone believed they owned her. A man, I think. A man with power and pride. She broke something in him, perhaps more than one." "Delacroix?" Hastings asked. "Perhaps. But I think we are missing something. A piece that would reveal the entire picture if tilted just so." Poirot moved to the table, where he had been making small, unobtrusive notes during each interview. He circled a name with his pencil. "Henri," he said as the young assistant entered again. "Please fetch the stage manager, Monsieur René Dervieux." Henri blinked. "René? Why?" "Because," Poirot said quietly, "no one moves through the wings, up the stairs or onto the catwalk without his notice. If someone met Celestine that night, he would know." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And perhaps," he added, "we will learn at last who it was she trusted enough to follow into the shadows." René Dervieux entered with the hesitant stiffness of a man who was more at home among ropes and rigging than in front of scrutiny. He was tall, with a weathered face and a wiry build that suggested years of hauling weights and scaling ladders in silence. A cap clung to his graying hair, and his overalls bore the marks of long use, dust, oil, and a faint trace of stage paint near the collar. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, giving a short nod. "You asked for me." "Indeed, Monsieur Dervieux," Poirot replied warmly, motioning to the chair. "We have spoken to dancers and patrons, directors and mentors. But the theatre has another heart, does it not? One hidden in its bones and beams. And it is you, I believe, who feels its pulse." Dervieux gave a reluctant shrug, but a faint trace of pride flickered in his eyes. "I've worked in this house for 18 years. I know every board that creaks and every curtain that sways when it shouldn't." "Then perhaps you can help me with a small puzzle," Poirot said, folding his hands. "Celestine Marais. She ascended the catwalk during the final act, yes?" "She did." "You saw her?" "I didn't see her go up," Dervieux said carefully. "But I heard the footsteps. Light ones, ballet shoes. No mistaking them." "And you were where, exactly?" "Stage right, behind the velvet drop. I'd gone to adjust the pulley for the storm backdrop. It tends to catch on damp nights." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you are certain the footsteps belonged to her?" "I assumed. It was her cue soon, but then I heard another set of steps. Heavier. Not long after the first." Poirot's gaze narrowed. "Another person followed her up?" "Yes." "Did you see who it was?" Dervieux's mouth twisted. "No, but I know who uses that path. Not many do. Most of the cast are afraid of the heights. Even Elodie sticks to the lower levels. But the one who goes up often, late at night when no one's around." "Oui?" Poirot prompted gently. "Julien Delacroix." Hastings frowned. "Delacroix?" Dervieux nodded. "When he's here, he walks the rigging sometimes. Says he likes the perspective. that it reminds him of controlling a chessboard. Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. Fascinating. But, Dervieux added, his brow creasing, that night something was different. There was a pause. A pause? Poirot repeated. The steps, hers, stopped halfway up. Then a hesitation. Then more steps. His. And then nothing. Silence. Poirot leaned forward. How long until she fell? 3 minutes, maybe 4. Poirot nodded again, slower this time. Merci, Monsieur Dervieux. One more question. Had you seen Mademoiselle Marais acting unusually in recent days? Dervieux's face darkened. She was nervous, not in the way dancers get before a premiere. No, she kept checking the fly rail as though expecting something to fall. I even found her up there once at night, crouching near the lighting grid. Said she was looking for inspiration. Inspiration. What she was really doing was hiding something. Hiding something? Hastings asked. Dervieux glanced between them. She slipped something into a hollow panel in the rigging. I didn't see what, but I saw her climb down without it. Poirot's eyes lit up. And has anyone been up there since? Dervieux shook his head. No one dares. Not after what happened. Poirot stood abruptly. Then we must go. Within minutes, Poirot, Hastings, and Dervieux stood beneath the tall iron ladder that led into the theatre's upper rigging. The vast dome above was thick with shadows, rigging lines hanging like strands from a web. Poirot stared upward. I'm not fond of heights, Hastings, he muttered. Shall I go? Hastings offered, already taking hold of the first rung. No, no, it is the task of Hercule Poirot. It is the crime that speaks to me. It whispers, even here. With surprising agility, Poirot began his ascent, though Hastings watched with more anxiety than admiration. Halfway up, Poirot paused, then continued slowly, examining each beam and strut. Near the highest platform, tucked behind a rusted lighting bracket, he found a loose wooden panel. He removed it carefully. Inside was a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. Poirot pocketed it before descending. Once on the ground, Poirot unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with wax. No address, no name. He turned it over. The seal had already been broken. Poirot opened the envelope. Inside, a folded sheet of paper, brittle and creased. He read the contents silently. Then again. Then a third time. More slowly. What is it? Hastings asked, peering over his shoulder. Poirot handed him the page. It was a letter, written in a sharp, elegant hand. Celestine. You think you can dance away from the truth, but you forget, ma petite, that I saw what you did. We all watched, yes, but I heard what you said when you thought no one listened. You should have chosen silence. Instead, you opened your mouth to the wrong person. There will be consequences. Your beauty will not protect you forever. The curtain always falls. There was no signature. Hastings stared at the letter, then looked up, aghast. Good God! This is a threat. Poirot gave a tight nod. A calculated one. And it was meant to frighten her, not kill her, not yet. She hid it, perhaps as leverage. Proof. But the moment she kept it, she became a danger to someone. Hastings lowered the letter slowly. So someone tried to silence her permanently. No, Poirot said, eyes glittering. Someone tried to frighten her again, perhaps into obedience, perhaps into disappearance, but something went wrong. Either she resisted, or the confrontation escalated. Dervieux cleared his throat uneasily. What do you mean, escalated? I do not yet know if Mademoiselle Marais fell, or if she was pushed, but now, at last, we have something real. He held up the envelope again. A ghost cannot write threats, nor hide letters. We are no longer in the realm of poetry and illusion, mon ami. We are in the realm of fear. And fear, he added softly, always reveals the truth in the end. They returned to Poirot's temporary suite at the Hôtel Virelais. By the time they arrived, Poirot was already sketching lines on a sheet of paper, mapping relationships like a chessboard. Celestine at the center, with lines connecting her to Lagrange, Delacroix, Élodie, and now an unnamed author of threats. "There is a motive still unseen," Poirot murmured. "Something that binds them all. Jealousy, perhaps. But jealousy is a symptom, not a cause." He looked up at Hastings. "I must speak with Élodie again. Alone this time. Do you think she knows more than she said?" "I think," Poirot said, "that she has chosen silence for a reason." Before Hastings could respond, a bell rang. Poirot answered. It was Henri, breathless. "Inspector Moreau has arrived, and he's bringing with him the theatre's financial records. He says you requested them?" Poirot's smile was faint but sharp. "Ah, yes. Because before there was a fall, before there was a threat, there was money, and wherever there is money, mon ami, there is motive hiding in its shadow." Inspector Moreau's arrival brought with it a tangible shift in the atmosphere, like a gust of sharp autumn wind slicing through a room warmed by firelight. He was a precise man, thin-lipped, clean-shaven and immaculate in his uniform, with a briskness that seemed to announce, without need for words, that the time for artistic sentiment had passed. He carried a flat leather case under one arm and handed it to Poirot the moment he stepped inside the suite. "Financial records of Théâtre des Muses, as requested," he said, "and a few others. Bank ledgers, ticket sales, even staff contracts. I thought you might wish for a broader view." "Très bien," said Poirot, taking the case with delicate care, as if it contained something fragile. "Merci, Inspector. You are thorough, and that I appreciate." Moreau gave a short nod, his gaze falling to the paper on Poirot's table, the web of names and motives. "Anything new?" Poirot gestured toward the letter now lying between paperweights. "A threat, hidden in the rigging, written in a careful hand, full of implication. It suggests Celestine Marais was in possession of knowledge dangerous to someone else." Moreau studied the letter. "No name. But this is no idle menace. Do you think it's from someone in the company?" "Undoubtedly," Poirot said, "and I suspect the contents of these ledgers will tell us more than simple figures. May I?" He opened the case and began leafing through the documents, page after page of orderly numbers and signatures. Poirot's brow furrowed in concentration as he examined quarterly expenditures, balances, and payroll schedules. Then he paused. "There," he said, tapping the corner of a page. "You see this?" Moreau leaned in. "A withdrawal, 5,000 francs, March 17th, unusual amount." "Not the amount," Poirot murmured. "The recipient. C. Marais." But here, he flipped 2 pages forward. On March 20th, the theatre's expenses record a private advance to J. Delacroix, 3,000 francs. No explanation given. "A transfer of funds?" Hastings asked, puzzled. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Or a funnel, a redirection. It is not the amount that interests me. It is the timing." Moreau frowned. "You think Delacroix was using Marais?" "I think Mademoiselle Marais had access to something, or knew something, connected to Delacroix and money. Perhaps she discovered a misappropriation. Perhaps she agreed to take the payment on paper, only to return it to him quietly." Moreau's gaze darkened. That could be embezzlement. "Or blackmail," Poirot added softly. At that moment, the bell rang again. Henri appeared once more, this time holding an envelope. "For Monsieur Poirot, delivered by courier." Poirot accepted it, examining the handwriting before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of music manuscript. The ink was fresh, the staff lines neatly ruled by hand. A melody had been sketched out, but with sharp, deliberate changes. Notes crossed out, rewritten, circled, as if in haste. Poirot frowned. "This is curious." "What is it?" Hastings asked. "A variation of the score used in the final act of Les Larmes d'Icar. But these notes, see, they do not match the performance. Version. And the handwriting is that of Célestine Marais." He studied the notes for a long moment, then abruptly rose. "We go now to speak with Élodie Girard." Moreau followed without protest. In the coach on the way to Élodie's apartment, a modest but refined studio near Montmartre, Poirot remained silent, his mind clearly racing. When they arrived, Élodie opened the door herself. She looked tired, her makeup removed, revealing the fine lines of worry beneath her eyes. "You've found something," she said before anyone spoke. Poirot inclined his head. "May we enter?" She stepped aside, and they were ushered into a small sitting room where a vase of wilting carnations sat beside a sewing kit. Élodie took a seat opposite Poirot and clasped her hands tightly. "I know what you want to ask." "Then permit me to ask it nonetheless," Poirot replied gently. "Why did Célestine change the final melody of the production?" Élodie's eyes widened. "You found the score?" "Yes. Delivered to me today. A strange coincidence, unless someone wanted me to see it. The question is why." Élodie looked down, then slowly reached into a drawer and pulled out a second sheet of music, identical in structure, but subtly different in its phrasing. "This," she said, "is the original, the version Célestine was supposed to dance to. She altered it after the last rehearsal. Julian objected, but she insisted." "Why?" Hastings asked. "Because she said it would fit better," Élodie said. "But that was a lie." Poirot nodded slowly. "Go on." "She changed the music because she was trying to send a message, a signal. I think... No, I know she meant it for me." Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why you?" Élodie drew a long breath. "Because Célestine knew. About me and Julien. About what we did. The money. The arrangement. I begged her to keep quiet. She promised she would. But something changed last week. She found out Julian was still seeing someone else. She thought it was me." Hastings looked startled. "Was it?" "No," Élodie said bitterly. "It was someone else. A patron, I think. Older, wealthy. He funded the restoration of the Grand Chandelier last year, but Célestine thought I was still involved, and she felt betrayed. That's when she changed. She began talking about starting over, about setting things right." Poirot leaned back, tapping a finger against his lips. "And you feared she might expose everything." "I did," Élodie whispered. "But I didn't kill her. I swear it." Moreau interjected. "Mademoiselle Girard, we now have reason to believe she received threats. Did you write this?" He held out the letter from the rigging. She paled and shook her head vehemently. "No, that's not my handwriting. I swear on my life." Poirot studied her face, then rose. "I believe you. For now." As they stepped back into the corridor, Hastings turned to him. "You believe her?" "I believe she is frightened," Poirot replied, "and fear rarely inspires murder. It more often prevents it." Moreau folded his arms. "So who are we left with?" Poirot's gaze drifted upward as though seeing the rafters of the theatre again. "Someone who moves through shadows, who knows the timing of a cue, the weight of a platform, the rhythm of a dancer's descent. Someone who used Célestine's fear not to silence her, but to control her." Hastings frowned. "Control her into doing what?" "That, mon ami, is the next question. But we are close. The answers are no longer hidden. They are waiting to be assembled." Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper as he opened the carriage door. "All that remains is the pattern." The rain began to fall lightly as they stepped from Élodie Girard's apartment, the narrow streets of Montmartre glistening under the gas lamps like wet silk. Poirot pulled his overcoat close with a fastidious tug. his hat angled just so, eyes distant in concentration. Hastings, walking at his side, glanced at him now and again, careful not to interrupt the current of thought that so clearly flowed behind his companion's gaze. Moreau walked just behind them, silent for once, his usually brisk demeanor tempered by the weight of recent revelations. The three men made their way back toward the Théâtre des Muses, but Poirot halted suddenly beneath the awning of a bookshop whose windows had long since gone dark. "You see, Hastings," he said quietly, "it is not the fall that concerns me. It is the precision of it, the calculated certainty." "The fall?" Hastings echoed, puzzled. "Célestine Marais. She did not stumble. She did not slip in error. She fell twice, once long ago in the ballet that made her famous, and now again in death. Both, I believe, were orchestrated." Moreau raised an eyebrow. "You think the choreography of the original performance has something to do with the murder?" Poirot turned to face them. Célestine's dance was one of descent. Her role, an angel cast from grace. The second act concludes with her fall, a literal plunge from the suspended platform. In the original version, she floated downward with careful rigging, guided by wire. But the music she altered. It changed the cue, shifted the moment of descent. Hastings blinked. "You mean—" "I mean, someone used that musical change as an opportunity, a signal, not just to the audience, but to the killer. The music told the killer exactly when she would be in position, vulnerable, alone in the spotlight, her safety dependent on timing and trust." Moreau narrowed his eyes. So someone tampered with the rigging based on her altered score. Or more precisely, someone knew she would change it. Someone who anticipated her behavior, perhaps even suggested it. Moreau's jaw clenched. Julien Delacroix. Poirot gave a faint nod, though his eyes did not gleam with satisfaction, only measured contemplation. Perhaps he would have motive, means, and opportunity, but motive is rarely so straightforward in affairs of the heart. And Delacroix, he is impulsive, jealous, perhaps, but not subtle. No, this crime was executed with finesse. He glanced at the manuscript again. The false musical variation folded into his coat. "We must return to the theatre." Inside the Théâtre des Muses, the hush of late evening pressed in like velvet. The house was dark, the stage bare, except for a soft pool of amber light where the final performance had taken place. Poirot led them not to the dressing rooms, nor to the wings, but to the catwalks above the stage, the unseen realm of counterweights, pulleys, and ropes. They climbed carefully, the iron stairs slick from condensation. The catwalk swayed faintly with each step, and Poirot moved slowly, with deliberate grace. "This is where she would have risen," he murmured, pointing toward a series of cables. "And here, see the rigging. There is something not quite right." He crouched beside one of the pulleys and removed a small, sharp object, something glinting in the lamplight. "A blade," Moreau said, leaning in. "Clean. Fixed to the wire housing. It would fray the cord slowly, imperceptibly, until tension caused it to snap." "Exactly," Poirot said, rising. "A fool would cut the line outright, but this took preparation. The cord was weakened so it would fail only during the precise moment of the drop." Hastings whistled. "Then the murderer didn't even need to be here at the time." "No," Poirot said softly. "But they needed to know everything. Célestine's cue, the lighting, the sound, even her choice to delay the descent by 8 seconds with the changed music." Moreau exhaled. "Someone from the technical crew? Possibly. Or someone who worked closely with them. We must speak to the stage manager at once." They descended quickly, and Henri, summoned by a quick knock on his apartment door at the rear of the theatre, joined them within minutes, bleary-eyed but cooperative. "You said you saw nothing unusual the night of the fall," Poirot began. "But I must ask, did anyone approach the catwalks in the days before the performance?" Henri frowned, rubbing his chin. "Not many. Only Lucien, the lighting technician. He goes up often for maintenance, and sometimes Frédéric. Frédéric? Henry nodded. The set designer. But he's usually in the workshop below. He doesn't handle the rigging. Still, Poirot said, please fetch him for us. It took some time, but Frédéric arrived, a wiry man with sunken cheeks and large, work-hardened hands. He looked startled to be questioned, but answered steadily. No, I didn't touch the catwalks. I build the sets, paint the backdrops. The rigging isn't my domain. You had no reason to be above the stage. This week? He shook his head. None. Yet you knew the music would change, Poirot said quietly. Frédéric's eyes narrowed. What? Celestine's revised score. You painted the backdrop to match the new cue. Did you not? The man hesitated. She asked me to, a day before the show. And you didn't question it? Frédéric shrugged, unease flickering across his face. She was the star. Poirot studied him a moment longer. Merci? Frédéric turned to leave, but Poirot's voice stopped him. One more question. You were once a dancer, were you not? The man froze. What? You trained at the conservatoire 6 years ago, injured during rehearsal. A fall. Hastings looked up, surprised. How do you know that? Poirot's gaze never left Frédéric's face. Because Célestine Marais was there too, and she choreographed the routine you fell in. It was her first piece. Frédéric's fists clenched at his sides. That was a long time ago, but not forgotten, Poirot said softly. You were replaced, discarded. Your injury cost you everything. Frédéric looked away, jaw tight. I made a new life. And when she returned to Paris, famous, adored, you painted her sets. You watched her relive your dream on the very boards that once held yours. Silence stretched. Poirot's voice lowered. And then you saw her change the music. The same music as the piece you once danced together. You knew the rhythm, the cue. You had the opportunity and motive not just of anger, but of humiliation. Frédéric didn't speak. Poirot turned. Moreau, take him into custody. The inspector stepped forward. But before he could place a hand on the man's shoulder, Frédéric's voice rang out. She ruined my life. Twice. His words echoed in the rafters. Poirot's eyes closed for a moment, not in triumph, but in quiet sorrow. No, he said softly. You allowed her to. That is the tragedy. The knights swallowed their footsteps as they left the theatre. Poirot walked slowly, not triumphant, but thoughtful, his hands clasped behind his back. Human nature, Hastings, he murmured. It is more fragile than glass, and more dangerous when cracked. The café where Poirot and I sat the next morning was modest and tucked along a quiet street, far from the glamour of the Champs-Élysées and the turbulent whispers still circulating the theatre district. Outside, Paris was waking with a kind of wounded grace. Pedestrians moved beneath a pale sky, and the newspaper kiosks displayed headlines about the tragedy at Théâtre des Muses. Yet Poirot, calm and inscrutable as ever, stirred his coffee with unhurried precision, a small frown creasing his brow. I don't quite see what more there is to uncover, I said, leaning in. You exposed Frédéric's resentment, his opportunity, and his knowledge of the score. He practically confessed. Non, mon ami, Poirot murmured, setting his spoon aside. He confessed that she ruined his life, yes, but not that he took it in return. I blinked. You mean, you don't think he's guilty? He may be involved. Certainly he had the motive and perhaps the bitterness to imagine such a crime. But there is something, how shall I say, artless in Frédéric's demeanor. His grief was real, his hatred, yes, also. But I do not believe he has the finesse to execute the perfect timing of such a murder. Not without help. I stirred uneasily. So we're back at the beginning. Non, he said gently. We are further along than you think. A tapestry, Hastings often appears tangled from behind. But look at the front, and the design begins to emerge. He paused, tapping his fingertips on the table. Consider the reaction of the others. Lucian, the lighting man. Did you notice how quickly he pointed away from himself to the stage manager and crew? And Elodie? She was evasive about Celestine's relationships, especially about Mademoiselle Maret's recent quarrel. She said it was over something petty. Indeed. But jealousy, like poison, rarely announces itself with a fanfare. Tell me, what did she say about Celestine's time away from Paris? I frowned, trying to recall. She said she toured in London, that she came back because her career had stalled abroad. Poirot nodded. Just so. And yet Julien Delacroix claimed she had offers even after her return, that she was about to sign a contract in Berlin. Then she was leaving again. It would seem so. And that, Hastings, provides a motive more elegant than revenge. Abandonment. You think Delacroix killed her to stop her from leaving him? Poirot leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly. It is one possibility, but as you know, I do not accuse until I am certain. No, I must first examine the contradictions, the gaps between words and truth. A waiter passed by, and Poirot caught his arm gently. Pardon, monsieur. May I trouble you for yesterday's copy of Le Soir? There was a photograph in it. Yes, of the dress rehearsal at the theatre. I believe it is still behind the counter. The man nodded and returned moments later with the paper, slightly crumpled. Poirot opened it carefully, flattening the creases with precision, then studied the image printed across the arts section. It showed the final moment of Celestine's routine, poised mid-air, suspended above the stage by the invisible rigging. Her arms were flung outward like wings, her expression fierce and luminous. Beside her, Julien stood in shadow, observing from the wings. There, Poirot said suddenly, pointing. Do you see? I peered closely. She looks radiant. That's what everyone said. No, not her. Look behind Julien. In the wings. There, a figure half obscured. I followed his gaze. A woman stood just behind the curtain, pale, motionless, eyes fixed on Celestine. Elodie Girard, I breathed. She was watching. She claimed she had left by then, Poirot said quietly. But here she is. Curious, is it not? Moreau joined us minutes later, summoned by Poirot's cryptic note. His expression was skeptical but respectful. He had seen too many of Poirot's little grey cells in action to ignore them now. You still believe there's more? He asked, sliding into the chair beside us. Indeed. I must ask, Inspector, was Elodie Girard's alibi confirmed? She claimed she left the theatre at 9:30. She did. The doorman saw her exit. But there's a back entrance, unused most days. Poirot gave a short nod. Then let us speak to her again. This time, I believe she will be less inclined to lie. We found Elodie at the ballet school adjoining the theatre, where she was giving instruction to a room of small, pink-slippered girls. She emerged to meet us in the hallway, breathless and flushed, strands of hair escaping her bun. I already told you everything I know, she said tightly, eyes darting between the three of us. Poirot smiled gently. Yes, mademoiselle, and you told it with such grace that we almost believed you. But I must show you something. He produced the photograph and held it out. You claimed to have left the theatre before the final rehearsal began. Yet here, in the photograph, you are clearly visible. Her lips parted. The color drained from her cheeks. I didn't mean to lie. You returned through the back, Poirot continued. You watched from the wings, not because you wished to see the performance, but because you already knew what might happen. No, she said, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. I didn't know she would die, I swear it. But you suspected something, perhaps even feared it. Elodie's hands trembled. She pressed them together. I saw Julien arguing with her. she whispered. 3 nights before, after the final rehearsal. She told him she was leaving, not just for Berlin, but for good. She said she was tired of hiding, of being his secret. Moreau exchanged a look with Poirot. His secret. She was his mistress, Elodie said bitterly. They kept it quiet. He didn't want the board to know, or his fiancée. His fiancée? I asked, startled. Elodie nodded. A patron of the arts, very wealthy. He was planning to announce it soon. Celestine found out. She said she would ruin him. Poirot folded his arms. So he had reason to silence her. The scandal, the money, the betrayal. She threatened him, Elodie said. But I never thought. Who else knew of their affair? Poirot asked. Only me. And maybe Henri. Henri, the stage manager. She hesitated. He's loyal to Julien. He wouldn't betray him. Poirot's face was unreadable. Loyalty, mademoiselle, can be a weapon or a shield. He turned to Moreau. We must speak with Julien Delacroix again, privately. I believe he has played the role of wounded lover too well. As we walked once more toward the Théâtre des Muses, I felt the tightness in the air deepen, as if the walls of the city themselves were leaning in to hear the final truth. Poirot moved quickly now, no longer lingering in thought. The design, it seemed, had become clear to him, and in his hand, folded in quarters, he carried the photograph. The image of a dancer poised in a moment of impossible beauty, and behind her the shadows of those who had watched her fall. The Théâtre des Muses was nearly silent as we returned that afternoon. The scent of dust and velvet hung in the air like a ghost, and the hushed corridors lent a solemnity to our purpose. The theatre was closed for the day, but Inspector Moreau had arranged for us to speak with Julien Delacroix in the privacy of his office, a sparse, modern space at odds with the ornate Baroque splendor of the theatre itself. Julien greeted us with a faint air of detachment, his eyes tired, his hands clasped behind his back as he stood near the large window overlooking the stage. Though composed, there was a wariness in his posture now, as if he sensed that Poirot's visit would not be perfunctory. You wish to see me again, Monsieur Poirot, he said. Poirot inclined his head. Oui, Monsieur Delacroix. There are still a few threads that dangle most inconveniently. I wish only to tidy them. Julien gestured toward the chairs. Please sit, though I confess I am exhausted from all of this. Question after question, accusation after accusation. You must understand, I have lost someone. Poirot raised a hand. Pardon, you will forgive me, but I must interrupt before grief clouds the clarity we seek. It is true you have lost someone, but it is not Celestine Marais you mourn. It is your reputation. Julien's expression flickered. Brief, but perceptible. He recovered quickly. You presume too much. Ah, but presumption is the first cousin of deduction, no? Poirot's voice remained calm. Let us speak plainly, Monsieur Delacroix. You are having an affair with Mademoiselle Marais. And yet you were also engaged to a wealthy benefactress whose funding supports this very theatre. This is not hearsay. Mademoiselle Girard confirmed it. The relationship with Celestine was no longer convenient. She had become, what is the word, an obstacle. Delacroix's mouth tightened, but he made no denial. I loved Celestine, he said finally, in my own way. But it was complicated. She wanted things I could not give. She became demanding, possessive. When I told her I was getting engaged, she was furious. She threatened to ruin you, Poirot supplied gently. She threatened to reveal everything. She said she'd go to the press, that she'd tell my fiancé. Sabine would have withdrawn her patronage, and with it, the theatre's funding, I'd be finished. Poirot nodded slowly. So you were trapped. A man of the arts, faced with the end of your career, your respectability. Unless, of course, Mademoiselle Marais were silenced. Julien stood abruptly. I didn't kill her. I believe you. Poirot said, and the words hung in the room like a subtle twist in the air. Julien blinked. You do? I do, for one very specific reason. You would not have staged her death so theatrically. A man like you seeks discretion, not spectacle. You would have found a quieter way, something without ropes and rigging. Moreau raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Julien seemed too stunned to speak. However, Poirot continued, rising, you are guilty of another sin. You created the motive. You gave the killer their reason. As we left Julien's office, Moreau leaned in, lowering his voice. Then who do you suspect now, Poirot? Ah, Poirot said, walking slowly. That is the final question, n'est-ce pas? Let us revisit the facts. Mademoiselle Marais was threatened. She was watched. Someone knew she planned to leave Paris. And the method of her murder, it required access to the rigging, yes, but also the confidence to alter it without being observed. That suggests someone both trusted and invisible. The stage manager? I asked. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Henri Bellard? Perhaps. But he is cautious, anxious, the type who would unravel quickly under pressure, and yet he is not. That makes me look elsewhere. A figure was approaching down the corridor, tall, lean, carrying a tool belt slung low on one hip. Lucien Morel, the lighting technician, nodded curtly to us. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector? Ah, Monsieur Morel, Poirot said smoothly. May we borrow a moment? Lucien hesitated, then shrugged. Of course. They walked together along the edge of the stage, Poirot's tone conversational. You were here during the final rehearsal, yes? You saw the routine? Sure, I see them all. Lighting cues, timing, all of it goes through me. Then you must have seen the moment, the exact moment when Mademoiselle Marais fell. Lucien's brow furrowed. I heard it more like. The thump. People screaming. But not the rigging. No, I was focused on the follow spot. She was in air 1 second and the next. Poirot nodded. And who else would have been in a position to tamper with the rigging? Lucien glanced around. Stagehands, I suppose. Maybe Henri. But he wouldn't. He's loyal. Old school. Would you mind, Poirot said softly, showing me precisely where the counterweights are kept? Lucien hesitated, then led us to the side of the stage, behind a heavy velvet curtain. There, a small panel door led to a narrow corridor, lined with levers, pulleys, and ropes. The counterweight system was tucked in the corner, simple, mechanical, and now ominous in its silence. Poirot stepped inside and examined the rigging. This is where it was secured? Lucien nodded. Yes, and the failure happened here, on this line. Poirot traced the rope with his fingers, then turned suddenly. You repaired it after the accident? Had to. Safety inspection required it. And did anyone help you? Lucien blinked. No, I work alone. Poirot's eyes gleamed. That is convenient. You see, there would be no one to contradict your version of how the system was found. Lucien's jaw tightened. What are you implying? I imply nothing, I observe. You had access, knowledge, and you, unlike the others, stayed in the shadows while everyone else stepped forward to grieve. Why is that, Monsieur Morel? Lucien's mouth twitched. Because I don't put on performances for the press. I just do my job. And yet, Poirot said softly, you made a mistake. He produced something from his pocket, a small curled fragment of waxy black fabric. This was found inside the pulley housing, a piece of dance shoe. Celestine's, it was caught there, indicating the rig had already frayed before the performance. Deliberate weakening. Lucien's face darkened. You can't prove that was me. But you knew, Poirot said gently. You knew she would be lifted by that line. You knew the tension and weight required. And more importantly, you knew she was planning to leave Paris, to leave the company, to leave you. Lucien stared at him, motionless. Poirot's voice was quieter now, almost kind. "You were in love with her." It wasn't a question. "She never saw it," Lucien whispered. "Never saw what I gave. I lit her like a star, built the whole rigging routine around her flight. I made her soar." "And yet," Poirot said, "she fell." Lucien's fists clenched. "She was leaving. I heard her say it backstage, that she was done with the theater. With all of us. You sabotaged the line." "I didn't think she'd die," he said hoarsely. "Just fall, break a leg maybe, something to stop her from going." Silence fell. Poirot looked to Moreau, who nodded slowly. It was over. As Lucien was led away, the empty theater felt heavier somehow, as if the air itself had absorbed the tragedy. Poirot stood alone at the edge of the stage, gazing up at the rigging. "She danced for all of them," he said. "For love, for revenge, for glory. But in the end, it was the one who loved her silently who brought her down." He turned, brushing a speck from his lapel. "And now," he said, "there is but one final curtain left to fall." Poirot's words, "one final curtain left to fall," echoed softly in my mind as we stepped once more into the quiet evening air of Montmartre. The street lamps flickered like half-awake sentinels, their golden glow bleeding across the cobbled pavements. A fine mist had begun to fall, lending the Parisian skyline a ghostly blur. We walked in silence for several minutes before I found my voice. "You're certain, then?" I asked. "That it was Lucien Morel?" Poirot adjusted his gloves with slow, methodical precision, his gaze fixed on the distance. "Mon ami, certainty is a dangerous word. One must always leave room for the improbable. But as for logic, as for the facts, we are close, so very close." "But he confessed." "He confessed, yes," Poirot said thoughtfully. "But only to a motive. Not the murder. Not in full. And it is that subtle difference which troubles me." I halted, the damp street cold beneath my feet. "You believe he is innocent?" "I believe he is telling the truth as he sees it. That he sabotaged the rigging, yes. But you must ask yourself, why did it fail so completely, so precisely at that moment?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And why was Celestine already dead before she fell?" I stared at him. "Already dead, but the coroner—" "The coroner observed massive trauma. We, consistent with the fall, but there were inconsistencies. A trace of blood at the back of the neck, a mark, very faint, not caused by impact. Moreau shared the detail with me this morning." "Then she was killed before she was hoisted?" "Exactement. The fall was theatrical, quite literally. A deception meant to misdirect. And Lucien's guilt lies in intent, not execution. He weakened the line, hoping to injure her. But someone else struck the final blow." We resumed our walk, now quickening pace toward the Théâtre des Muses. Poirot's mind was visibly at work, his little grey cells clicking into place like the tumblers of a lock. When we arrived, Inspector Moreau was already waiting beneath the marquee, puffing on a cigarette with a nervous energy uncharacteristic of him. "You're back," he said. "I was just about to head home." Poirot lifted a hand. No, my friend. The final scene is upon us. You will want to witness it. Where are they?" "Inside. I asked the principal suspects to gather in the salon behind the orchestra pit, as you requested." "Bon. Let us not keep them waiting." The salon was an opulent chamber of wine-red walls, gold-framed mirrors, and low, flickering sconces that cast long shadows across the marble floor. Seated around the room were the familiar faces. Julien Delacroix, pale and anxious. Sabine Vauquelin, stiff-backed with concealed fury. Henri Bellard, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. And Yvette Girard, who looked ready to bolt at any moment. Lucien, now in plain clothes and under a quiet guard at the door, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Poirot entered the room slowly, deliberately, as though stepping onto a stage. He took a position at the head of the long velvet settee and tapped his cane once on the floor. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, "I have gathered you here not to accuse, but to explain, to reveal what truly happened on the night of Celestine Maret's death. A death, I might add, which was no accident and no simple crime of passion." Julien shifted uncomfortably. Sabine's lips pursed into a severe line. "You all had reason to want her gone. Sabine, because her engagement to Julien would have been endangered by scandal. Julien, because Celestine threatened his career. Henri, because he feared being exposed for falsifying theatre expenses, a detail Celestine may have uncovered when she demanded a share in the profits. And Lucien, because of his unrequited love, his jealousy." Lucien flinched but said nothing. Poirot continued, "Yes, Lucien sabotaged the rigging, but he did not kill her. He did not strike the fatal blow." A hush fell. All eyes turned to Poirot, breath held. "The key lies in timing. The line was tampered with well before the performance, but the actual murder required precision. It happened in the brief window between Celestine's warm-up and the final call, when she went missing for 15 minutes. It was then she was struck, likely with a blunt object, enough to render her unconscious or dead before she was tied into the rigging and hoisted for her grand fall." Sabine looked faintly ill. Julien swore under his breath. Poirot's voice dropped, soft as silk. "And there is only one person who had both the opportunity and the presence of mind to orchestrate such an illusion." He turned slowly. "Mademoiselle Girard." Yvette went still. "That's absurd," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Why would I do such a thing?" Poirot stepped closer. "Because you were her understudy, her shadow, and always in her shadow. You wanted the spotlight, and you were promised it if Celestine fell." "I didn't. You knew Lucien had tampered with the rigging. You overheard it, and you saw an opportunity. You found Celestine alone in the costume room. You struck her from behind, quickly, efficiently. Then, knowing Lucien's sabotage would obscure the cause of death, you dragged her to the stage pulley system and affixed the rigging. You played your part. You screamed with the others. You mourned." Yvette's hands balled into fists. Her face flushed a deep crimson. She humiliated me. I gave everything, and she laughed, even when she knew Julien wanted me, not her. She danced like she owned the world. "You thought the world owed you a stage," Poirot said, gently but firmly. "And now you will have one. A courtroom." There was a gasp from Julien. Sabine stood abruptly, one hand pressed to her mouth. Moreau stepped forward, signaling the officers by the door. Yvette, trembling now, took a step back, her voice collapsing into sobs. As she was led away, Poirot turned, his expression unreadable. "She saw the fall as a way up," he murmured. "But one cannot rise through descent. It is a false elevation." In the stunned silence that followed, the room slowly emptied. Only Poirot and I remained, the muffled sounds of the theatre crew outside, reminding us that life, indifferent as ever, would resume. The curtain would rise again. "You had it all mapped out," I said, "from the moment you saw the rigging." Poirot gave a modest shrug. No. Only the suspicion. But suspicion, when cultivated properly, grows into certainty. One must be patient. The truth blooms only when the soil has been properly prepared. He glanced up at the chandeliers overhead, a distant melancholy in his eyes. "Tell me, Hastings, why is it that the stage, meant for dreams, so often becomes the setting for nightmares?" I had no answer, and Poirot, with his hands behind his back and his shoes echoing softly against the marble floor, walked slowly toward the exit. The curtain had fallen at last, but as always, behind his eyes, the performance continued. We stepped out into the night once more, the rain having lightened to a whispering drizzle that kissed the brim of Poirot's hat and slicked the cobbles underfoot. A hush had fallen over Montmartre. Even the normally raucous cafes seemed subdued, as if the whole quartier sensed that something final had transpired. But Poirot did not walk with the satisfaction of a man who had triumphed. His steps were slow, deliberate, thoughtful. For a while we said nothing, until I could bear the silence no longer. "It's over then," I said, not quite a question. "Over." Poirot raised a brow, his eyes dark with contemplation. "Ah, Hastings, the solving of a crime may be complete, but its reverberations, those are never truly over." He glanced back over his shoulder toward the theater's facade, where the ghost of applause and tragedy still seemed to cling to the arches. "What she did," I said quietly. "Yvette, it was monstrous, calculated." Poirot nodded. "Monstrous, oui, but not without its tragic logic. You see, she was not entirely mad. She was wounded, years of resentment buried just beneath the surface. When opportunity arrived, it dressed itself as justice." I frowned. "But surely justice isn't murder." "Non, mon ami, it is not," Poirot said firmly. "But to a heart twisted by humiliation and envy, vengeance disguises itself. It whispers that the pain one causes is balance restored. That, Hastings, is where the danger lies. Not in madness, but in reason gone awry." We arrived at our modest hotel, where the night clerk nodded sleepily as we passed. Poirot did not ascend to his room immediately. Instead, he moved to the lounge where a low fire still crackled. He took a seat near it, gesturing for me to join him. The flames painted shifting patterns across his face. "There is still one matter I cannot quite let rest," he said. I turned toward him. "You mean the murder?" "No," he said, his tone tightening. "I mean the details surrounding Lucien Morel." I blinked. "But you cleared him?" "Oui, of the act of murder. But he remains culpable for the sabotage. What troubles me is not his guilt, but his silence." Poirot leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers. "He said he weakened the rigging to frighten Celestine, to make her stumble, to cause injury perhaps. But he knew the timing. He knew when she would take her fall. Yet the sabotage, by Moreau's estimate, was designed to fail completely, catastrophically. You believe he meant to kill her after all?" "I believe he convinced himself he did not," Poirot replied. "But intention is a slippery thing, mon ami, especially when it nestles behind guilt." He sighed and sat back, the flickering fire catching the gleam in his eye. "Lucien will face his punishment, but it will be justice of another kind, internal, corrosive. Perhaps that is fitting. There are wounds that no prison can deepen." There was a long pause. I found myself staring into the fire, unsettled despite the warmth. "And Julien?" I asked. "What becomes of him and Sabine?" "Ah," Poirot said with a wistful smile. "That, Hastings, is the one piece of theatre still unrehearsed. But I suspect Sabine will not forgive easily, nor should she. Betrayal is a poor foundation for love." He rose, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves, and made his way toward the stairs. At the landing, he paused and looked back. "You see, my friend, it was not merely the dancer who fell. It was all of them, Morel, Girard, Delacroix. Each in their own way, each carried by the gravity of pride, love, envy. That is the true nature of tragedy. It is not the death, but the descent." I did not sleep well that night. My dreams were tangled with velvet curtains and mirrored dressing rooms, with shadows moving just beyond the reach of the light. I saw Celestine's face, first radiant, then broken, and woke with a start more than once. The following morning brought a thin sun and a welcome clarity. We took our breakfast on the terrace, overlooking the narrow street below. Poirot, as always, was immaculate, his boiled egg carefully dissected with surgical precision. He was already deep in contemplation, the faint hum of activity in the street seemingly miles from his mind. "I spoke to Moreau before breakfast," he said. Yvette has made a partial confession. She claims she acted alone, but I do not believe her entirely. I choked slightly on my tea. There was an accomplice? Poirot shook his head. No, not in the physical sense, but someone else played a part, someone who lit the fuse without striking the match. He set his spoon down and folded his hands. Celestine Marais was not a kind woman. She wielded her success like a sword, humiliated those she could, discarded those she used, and she knew her power. That knowledge made her careless. It made her enemies. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes shining. This is not to excuse her death, Hastings, but it is to understand it. For in understanding, we guard against repetition. It is why I do what I do. Not for vengeance, for balance. I nodded slowly, struck by the weight of his words. We departed Paris 2 days later. As the train pulled from the station, Poirot sat with his head turned to the window, watching the city recede behind us. He seemed, for once, tired. "Will you miss it?" I asked. "Paris." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Paris is always with me, Hastings. In my mind, in my habits. It is in the starch of my cuffs, the angle of my hat. But now it is time to let it rest." He glanced toward me, a trace of mischief returning to his expression. "And besides, London has become too quiet without me. Who knows what crimes have brewed in my absence?" I laughed, the tension easing at last. The countryside rolled by in patches of green and grey, and Poirot dozed briefly, his arms crossed and his expression serene. As the wheels clacked rhythmically beneath us, I opened my notebook to record the case, its details, its motives, its terrible irony. The dancer had fallen, but it was in the unmasking of those around her that the true performance had ended. And somewhere, deep in the heart of Poirot's little grey cells, the curtain was already rising on the next mystery. The train rolled gently through the French countryside, the golden fields giving way to clusters of trees and the occasional silhouette of a distant farmhouse. Poirot had been uncharacteristically quiet for most of the journey, his arms folded, his gaze distant but thoughtful. I had assumed the case of Celestine Marais was now entirely behind him, boxed and labelled in that meticulously ordered mind of his. Yet I should have known better, for even in apparent repose, the great detective was always at work. After a long interval he spoke, not loudly, but with a precision that drew me from my newspaper immediately. "There is something, Hastings, that I have not yet told you." I set the paper aside. "About the case?" "Mais oui, it concerns the second fall." I blinked. "You mean Celestine's original accident? The one in Prague?" Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze still on the passing landscape. "Do you remember the details of that fall?" "I believe it was said she slipped on stage," I recalled. "Some sort of flooring issue, was it not?" "So it was reported," Poirot said. "But Yvette mentioned something curious in her confession, something that passed unnoticed in the flurry of her revelations." He turned to me now, his expression serious. "She claimed she had not intended for Celestine to die, only to fall again, to be ruined, humiliated. Her phrasing was telling, as she did once before." I frowned. Surely that's just a reference to the Prague accident. Poirot shook his head gently. "But the tone, Hastings. It was too bitter, too personal. I believe Yvette suspected the first fall was not an accident at all." I stared at him. "You think someone caused that one as well?" "I believe it merits investigation. You see, Hastings, if the first fall was deliberate, it changes everything. It means that the campaign against Celestine did not begin in Paris, but earlier, perhaps much earlier." My mind reeled. But who could have done it? Yvette would have had no reason then. She was still just an understudy. "Just so," said Poirot, "which is why we must consider who benefited from the fall in Prague, who gained most from Celestine's absence on stage." The question hovered, unanswered. Poirot withdrew a small notepad from his inner coat pocket. On it were jottings I recognized from the interviews, names, details, dates. He tapped the page lightly with his finger. "Sabine Girard," he said softly. "She was with the company in Prague. She took over for Celestine after her injury, did she not?" "Yes," I said slowly. "But surely, Sabine?" "She adored Celestine, idolized her." Poirot smiled thinly. "So she claimed, but admiration, Hastings, is but a single step from resentment, particularly when one's own talents are overlooked." I opened my mouth to argue further, but Poirot held up a hand. "I do not accuse her, not yet. But think of the circumstances. A young, ambitious dancer in the shadow of a prima ballerina. A sudden accident, a rising career. Then, years later, that same dancer is the only one who remains loyal to the victim, visiting her grave, defending her memory." "You think it's a performance?" I asked, aghast. "I think," he replied carefully, "that we must allow for all possibilities. The mind, Hastings, it clings to its secrets long after the crime has passed. And this crime, it may be deeper, more layered than we knew." We traveled on in silence for a time. Poirot was not prone to throwing out theories without reason, and the fact that he now returned to a crime we thought concluded made me deeply uneasy. It suggested he had glimpsed some unfinished thread, some knot in the fabric of the case that would not sit flat. When we arrived in Calais, Poirot insisted on sending a telegram before boarding the ferry. He wrote it in French with care and precision, then handed it to the attendant. I caught a glimpse of the name at the top. "Moreau. You're contacting Inspector Moreau?" I asked. "Only to verify a suspicion," he said. "There are records to be examined, theater rosters, personnel changes. I require the exact date of Celestine's first fall and Sabine's promotion." "But we're returning to London," I reminded him. "What can we do from there?" "Sometimes, mon ami," Poirot said with a twinkle, "distance is the friend of clarity." The Channel crossing was uneventful, save for Poirot's persistent avoidance of the salty air. He remained firmly inside the cabin, nose wrinkled at the sea breeze. Once docked in Dover, we transferred to the train, bound for London, and by the time we reached Victoria Station, he was once again immersed in thought. We took a cab to Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot's elegant flat with its polished brass numbers and perfectly symmetrical lobby. The doorman greeted us with his usual mix of deference and curiosity, and Poirot acknowledged him with a brief nod. Inside, he immediately set to work, not even removing his coat before instructing his valet, George, to prepare the sitting room with his case files. It was well into the evening when the reply to his telegram arrived. Poirot read it in silence, then passed it to me. Accident occurred November 14th. Girard promoted November 16th. Temporary lead. Assumed full lead for 6-week run before Celestine resumed limited appearances. Recovered role upon Celestine's second withdrawal. I reread the dates. "She stepped in within 2 days," I said slowly. "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "And not only that, she retained the role far longer than necessary. Celestine returned for only a brief period. Then she withdrew again, citing pain. But what if the pain was more than physical? What if there was doubt, fear?" I was beginning to see his meaning. "You believe Sabine somehow orchestrated the fall, that she meant to sideline Celestine permanently?" "It is a possibility," Poirot said, "and one we must treat seriously. If she did so, then her later loyalty was guilt in disguise. A penance, perhaps, to ease the conscience. But the second fall, the murder, wasn't hers. That was Yvette." "Yes," Poirot agreed, "but if Yvette knew, or suspected, that the first fall had been engineered, it may have shaped her own path to vengeance. That is the echo I'm tracing, Hastings. The original fall may have planted the seed for all that followed." He stood then, suddenly decisive. Tomorrow, we will send for Sabine. She must come to London on the pretext of a final interview, perhaps an addendum for the police report. I must look into her eyes when she speaks of Prague. You think she'll crack? I asked. Poirot smiled faintly. We shall see, mon ami. We shall see. And so, just when I thought the curtain had fallen, Hercule Poirot once again took to the stage, this time in pursuit not of a killer, but of a hidden origin, the quiet crime that had set the others in motion. And in doing so, he would reveal the final descent of the dancer who fell not once, but twice. It was a grey morning when Sabine Girard arrived in London. She stepped off the early train from Paris dressed in quiet elegance, muted tones, tailored lines, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a long shadow over her eyes. She moved with the poise of a dancer still in command of her body, though age had softened the grace into something more measured, more deliberate. When she entered the drawing-room of Whitehaven Mansions, her eyes went straight to Poirot, who stood waiting beside the fireplace, hands behind his back. "Ah, Mademoiselle Girard," he said with polite warmth. "How good of you to come on such short notice." "You said it concerned the report," she said, her voice light but carrying an undercurrent of wariness. "A final clarification." "Just so," said Poirot, gesturing to the seat opposite his. "Please do sit." She did, smoothing her skirt with one practiced sweep. Her eyes flicked briefly to me, seated in my usual chair with a notebook in my lap, and then back to Poirot. He did not sit. Instead, he began to pace slowly, his steps deliberate, hands still clasped behind his back. "You knew Celestine a long time," he said. "Long before the Paris performances." "Of course. We trained together," she replied. "She was the star. I was always a step behind." Poirot smiled faintly. "You are modest, mademoiselle. But you danced in her place in Prague, no? When she fell?" "Yes," she said. "That was unfortunate, but the show had to continue." Poirot turned to face her. "And yet that fall, it was most convenient for you, no?" Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Inspector, if this is about Prague, I don't see—" "Not Inspector," Poirot said smoothly. "Simply Hercule Poirot. But please indulge me. You say the fall was unfortunate. Was it not curious to you that the stage, professionally maintained, should suddenly be so treacherous?" Sabine tilted her head. "Accidents happen." Poirot nodded. "They do, but in this case, mademoiselle, I believe it was no accident." Silence fell. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece sounded unnaturally loud. Sabine's fingers curled around the strap of her handbag. "You think I pushed her?" "Non, not pushed. That would be too crude, too obvious. But perhaps a screw left loose on the board, a smear of oil where the foot should not land. Something subtle, no? Enough to break a career, perhaps even a spirit, but not the body." Her expression did not change. She looked at Poirot with practiced calm. "That's a serious accusation." "It is an inquiry," Poirot corrected gently. "One based on a pattern. Celestine's first fall brought you to prominence. Her second fall ended her life, and both times you were close." She let out a soft breath and leaned back in her chair. "I didn't harm her." "Perhaps not with your hands," Poirot said. "But I ask myself, why did you remain close to her, even after your success? Most rivals drift apart, but you stayed, visited her, mourned her, defended her. It is most touching." "I owed her," Sabine said suddenly, her voice sharp. "Everything I am I owe to Celestine." "Ah," Poirot said quietly. "That is often the cry of those who betray most bitterly." A flash of anger rose in her eyes, then died just as quickly. "You're twisting things." "No," said Poirot. "I'm untwisting them. There was a campaign against her, mademoiselle. A campaign led by Yvette, yes. But its roots were deeper. The first fall was not from jealousy. It was not from vengeance. It was from ambition, I think." He moved closer now, lowering his voice. She returned to the stage after Prague, but something had changed. She danced with hesitation, no, as if afraid. Not of the pain, but of another fall. Sabine stared at him, her posture rigid. "You said you owed her," Poirot continued, "but you did not love her. You resented her. You wanted what she had." "I respected her," Sabine said, but her voice was faltering now. Poirot nodded. "Yes, but respect mixed with envy is a poison, and so you took your chance. Not to kill, no, you are not a murderer, but to create an opportunity, one she could not question, one you could deny, even to yourself." She was silent. Poirot sat down at last, his voice softer. "You did not know that your small sabotage would fracture her spirit. You did not imagine that her fall would be more than physical, but it was. You broke something inside her, and from that moment she was no longer the same." A long silence followed. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sabine spoke. "She was so perfect," she said. "Every movement, effortless. Everyone adored her. I worked just as hard, harder even, but she was always first, always." Poirot said nothing. "I never meant to ruin her," Sabine said. "I just wanted a chance. Just once." "And you had it," Poirot said gently. "But then came guilt, and the guilt became devotion. You could not undo what had been done, so you tried to stay close, to watch over her, perhaps even to protect her." "I never hurt her again," she said quickly. "No," Poirot agreed. "But you saw what Yvette was doing, did you not?" Sabine hesitated. "I suspected. You saw the cruelty, the whispering, and still you said nothing. I thought it would pass, that Celestine would recover." Poirot shook his head sadly. "But it did not pass, and the girl you once admired fell again. This time forever." Sabine looked away, her eyes shining. "So what happens now? Will you tell them?" Poirot regarded her carefully. "You did not murder Celestine, and the truth of Prague, it cannot be proven. It lives only in your heart, and that, I think, is punishment enough." Sabine closed her eyes. Poirot stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the misty city below. "It is curious, is it not, Hastings?" he said after a moment. "The first fall was silent, hidden, a private betrayal. The second, a loud spectacle, a public crime, but both sprang from the same root, envy and the aching wound of being second best." I nodded slowly. "It's a tragedy." Poirot turned back to us. "It is the theatre of life, mon ami, a stage where the applause can turn to silence in a heartbeat, where ambition can blind even the most graceful of soul." He walked Sabine to the door, pausing as she stepped out. "Let this be the last act," he said softly. "Close the curtain. Go in peace." She gave a faint nod and walked away, her figure shrinking in the corridor until she disappeared entirely. Poirot closed the door and turned to me with a long sigh. "And so," he said, "the dancer who fell twice has given us the full measure of her tragedy. Not one fall, but two, and both from very human heights." He walked to the mantelpiece and adjusted the small ornate clock by a single degree. "Now, Hastings," he said, "some tea, I think. The work of the little grey cells, it is always better followed by a tisane." And just like that, the great Hercule Poirot turned from the shadows of the stage. The mystery resolved, and the dance of deception finally stilled.